It began, as many political earthquakes do, not with a press conference, not with a headline, but with a whisper, a name buried in documents, a connection long denied, and a question that refused to disappear. In the quiet corridors of power, where reputations are crafted with precision and protected at all costs, something shifted. Files that were supposed to remain sealed started resurfacing. Associations that had once been dismissed suddenly demanded explanation. And at the center of it all, two names collided in a way that sent shockwaves through Washington's political elite: Donald Trump, Pam Bondi, and the shadow of Jeffrey Epstein. For years, the Epstein scandal has lingered like an unresolved storm, its full truth obscured by legal barriers, sealed records, and a network of powerful figures whose connections were never fully untangled. But now, the narrative was changing, not gradually, but violently. Because this time, it wasn't just about Epstein. It was about proximity, influence, and timing. Pam Bondi, once a prominent political figure and a loyal ally within Trump's orbit, had already faced scrutiny in the past. Questions about campaign donations, questions about decisions made during critical investigations, questions that never fully went away, but were never fully answered either. And now, those same questions were resurfacing, but with new weight. Because this time, they weren't isolated. They were connected to a growing archive of Epstein-related material, documents, testimonies, and legal trails that seemed to be forming a larger, more dangerous picture. A picture that suggested something far more complex than coincidence. And inside that picture was a network of relationships that blurred the lines between politics, wealth, and influence. A network that, once exposed, had the potential to destabilize not just reputations, but entire power structures. At first, the response was predictable: denials, deflections, silence. But then something changed. The tone shifted. The confidence that had once defined Trump's public posture began to crack, just slightly, but noticeably. Statements became more reactive. Messaging became more aggressive. And behind the scenes, according to insiders, the concern wasn't just about public perception anymore. It was about containment. Because what was emerging wasn't just another political controversy. It was a convergence. A moment where past decisions, financial connections, and legal actions were being re-examined under a microscope far more powerful than before. And in that scrutiny, patterns began to appear. Patterns that raised uncomfortable questions. Why did certain investigations stall? Why were specific actions, or inactions, taken at critical moments? And who stood to benefit from those decisions? The deeper analysts looked, the more unsettling the implications became. This wasn't just about whether individuals had crossed legal lines. It was about whether the system itself had been quietly manipulated. Because Epstein's story has always been about more than one man. It has always hinted at something larger, a structure that allowed him to operate, to evade consequences, to build relationships with some of the most powerful figures in the world. And if that structure existed, then who protected it? And more importantly, who was connected to it? As new revelations began to surface, political strategists, legal experts, and media institutions all found themselves grappling with the same realization. This story wasn't going away. In fact, it was accelerating. Every document release, every resurfaced interview, every connection drawn between past events and present narratives added another layer of tension. And with each layer, the pressure mounted. Not just on Bondi, not just on Trump, but on an entire political ecosystem that suddenly found itself vulnerable to a level of scrutiny it had long managed to avoid. And then came the turning point. A moment, not yet fully understood, not yet fully revealed, that insiders would later describe as the shift. The moment when concern turned into urgency, when political calculation gave way to strategic defense, when the question was no longer if this would become a crisis, but how far it would spread. Because in Washington, crises are rarely contained. They ripple, they expand, they expose. And what started as a quiet whisper was now becoming something far more dangerous, a narrative. A narrative that connected past decisions to present consequences. A narrative that suggested that what the public had seen so far was only a fraction of the full story. And as that narrative gained momentum, one truth became impossible to ignore. If these connections were real, if these patterns held, then the implications wouldn't just be political. They would be systemic. And that is where the real danger begins. Because when a scandal stops being about individuals and starts being about systems, it doesn't just threaten careers, it threatens power itself. And now, the question looming over everything was chillingly simple. What exactly was hidden in those files? And who knew about it? To understand why this controversy is different, why it carries a weight far heavier than a typical political scandal, you have to step back. Because this isn't just about names and documents. It's about a system, one that most people never see, never question, and rarely understand. A system built not on laws alone, but on influence. In Washington, power doesn't move in straight lines. It moves in networks, overlapping circles of politicians, donors, legal institutions, and media actors. Each node connected not by formal authority, but by something far more flexible and far more dangerous. Access. Access determines who gets investigated and who doesn't. Access determines which cases gain momentum and which quietly disappear. And access is rarely accidental. At the center of this system lies a delicate balance between money, politics, and justice. A balance that, when functioning as intended, maintains order. But when tilted, even slightly, it can reshape outcomes in ways the public never sees. This is where the Epstein case becomes critical. Because Epstein didn't just operate as an individual criminal. He existed within this network, interacting with powerful figures across finance, politics, and global elites. His survival, for as long as it lasted, wasn't just about secrecy. It was about insulation. Legal insulation, political insulation, reputational insulation. And insulation requires cooperation, whether active or passive. Now, insert Pam Bondi into that equation. Years before the current controversy, Bondi held one of the most influential legal positions in the United States, Attorney General of Florida. It was a role that came with enormous discretion, particularly in deciding which investigations to pursue and which to decline. At the time, Epstein's activities were already under scrutiny. There were allegations. There were victims. There were warning signs that, in hindsight, seem impossible to ignore. And yet, key moments in the legal process unfolded in ways that critics would later describe as unusually restrained. Decisions were made. Opportunities were missed. And outcomes, some argue, did not reflect the severity of the accusations. Back then, these events were seen as isolated, technical, procedural. But systems rarely reveal themselves in a single moment. They reveal themselves in patterns. Patterns that only become visible when viewed over time, across multiple decisions, across multiple players. And that's exactly what investigators and analysts are now doing. They are mapping connections, not just direct interactions, but contextual relationships, donations, meetings, institutional overlaps, timing. And when these elements are layered together, a more complex structure begins to emerge, one where influence doesn't need to be explicit, because in a system like this, it doesn't have to be. Consider this. Political donations are legal. Meetings between public officials and private individuals are routine. Legal discretion is a fundamental part of the justice system. Individually, none of these elements prove wrongdoing. But collectively, they can shape outcomes. Subtly, quietly, effectively. And this is where the tension escalates. Because the current controversy isn't just asking whether rules were broken. It's asking whether the rules themselves were navigated in a way that protected certain interests, whether decisions that appeared lawful on the surface were influenced by factors operating beneath it, and most importantly, whether the system allowed it to happen. For Donald Trump, this creates a unique vulnerability, because his political identity has long been built on the idea of fighting the system, challenging entrenched power, exposing hidden networks. But now, the narrative is shifting. Instead of being positioned outside the system, he is being examined as someone potentially connected to it, not necessarily through direct actions, but through proximity, alliances, and shared networks of influence. And in politics, perception can be as powerful as reality, especially when it aligns with an existing narrative. This is why the reaction has been so intense. Because if the public begins to see these connections not as coincidences, but as components of a larger system, then the implications extend far beyond one controversy. They raise fundamental questions about accountability, about transparency, about whether justice operates equally or selectively. And these are not comfortable questions for any political establishment. But there's another layer, one that makes this situation even more volatile. Information. In the past, controlling a narrative was easier. Documents could be sealed. Stories could be delayed. Public attention could be redirected. But today, the information ecosystem has changed. Leaks spread faster. Archives resurface. Independent analysts dissect data in real time. And once a narrative gains traction, it becomes incredibly difficult to contain. This is what insiders are now facing. A situation where the system itself is being examined, not by a single institution, but by a decentralized network of media, analysts, and public scrutiny. Every new detail doesn't just add information. It adds pressure. Pressure on political figures to respond. Pressure on institutions to explain past decisions. Pressure on the system to prove that it functions as intended. And under pressure, systems reveal their weaknesses. Because if there is one thing history has shown, it's this. Complex power structures are incredibly effective until they are exposed. And once exposed, they don't collapse all at once. They begin to fracture. Slowly at first, then all at once. Right now, the fractures are just beginning to show. Connections are being questioned. Decisions are being revisited. Narratives are being rewritten. And somewhere within this unfolding story lies a trigger point. A moment where the accumulation of pressure becomes too great to manage. A moment where the system can no longer rely on silence or ambiguity. A moment where something breaks. Because what's coming next isn't just analysis. It's reaction. And reaction is where crises truly begin. At first, it didn't look like a collapse. There were no dramatic resignations. No emergency press conferences. No immediate legal shockwaves. Just movement. Quiet, calculated movement inside institutions that had long mastered the art of appearing still. Requests for old records began to surface. Journalists revisited timelines that had once been considered closed. Legal analysts started asking questions, not new ones, but sharper ones. And in Washington, that's often how collapse begins. Not with noise, but with focus. Because once attention locks onto a pattern, it doesn't easily let go. What made this moment different wasn't just the resurfacing of Epstein-related material. It was the way those fragments began to align. Isolated details, once dismissed as unrelated, were now being placed side by side. And when viewed together, they told a different story. A story of timing. A story of decisions made at critical junctures. A story where key moments that could have altered outcomes, seemed to follow a strangely consistent trajectory. The deeper analysts dug, the more uncomfortable the questions became. Why were certain investigative paths not pursued aggressively? Why did specific legal opportunities dissolve before reaching full scrutiny? Why did individuals connected through overlapping networks repeatedly appear at pivotal points? Each question, on its own, could be explained away. But together, they created friction. And friction creates heat. That heat began to spread across multiple sectors, not just politics, but media, law, and public discourse. Major outlets, once cautious, started revisiting their coverage. Language shifted. What was previously framed as controversial began to be described as concerning, then significant. And then, something even more critical happened. Independent voices entered the equation. Digital investigators, legal commentators, and decentralized media platforms began dissecting timelines in real time. Unlike traditional institutions, they weren't constrained by editorial pacing or institutional caution. They moved faster, and they connected dots that others had hesitated to draw. Clips resurfaced. Old interviews gained new context. Archived statements were reanalyzed under the lens of current revelations. Suddenly, the narrative wasn't being shaped in one place. It was being shaped everywhere. And that's when the pressure intensified. Because decentralized scrutiny is unpredictable. It doesn't wait for confirmation. It doesn't follow a controlled narrative. And once it gains momentum, it's almost impossible to contain. For figures at the center of the controversy, this created a rapidly shifting battlefield. Statements that might have been sufficient in the past were now being dissected instantly. Every word analyzed, every omission questioned, and inconsistencies, no matter how small, were amplified. This is where the first signs of structural strain began to appear. Not in public declarations, but in strategic behavior. Messaging became reactive instead of proactive. Allies began distancing themselves, subtly at first, then more visibly. Legal teams shifted from confidence to caution, because behind closed doors, the realization was setting in. This wasn't a single narrative to control. It was multiple narratives converging at once. Legal exposure, political reputation, public trust, each one feeding into the other. And then came the trigger event. Not a single document, not a single revelation, but a convergence when multiple threads aligned at the same time. A resurfaced decision from years ago, a financial connection that gained new relevance, a timeline inconsistency that couldn't be easily explained. Individually, they were manageable. Together, they were destabilizing, because they didn't just raise questions. They challenged credibility. And in politics, credibility is everything. Once it begins to erode, the effects are immediate and often irreversible. Supporters start to hesitate. Allies begin calculating risk. Opponents seize momentum. And institutions, those same institutions that once provided insulation, start reassessing their position. Because systems, above all else, prioritize survival. And when a component of the system becomes a liability, it doesn't get protected. It gets isolated. This is the phase where collapse transitions from theoretical to operational, where decisions are no longer about managing perception, but about minimizing damage. And the damage, at this point, was no longer contained to individuals. It was spreading. Legal discussions expanded into broader questions about oversight. Political debates shifted from defense to accountability. Public discourse moved from curiosity to suspicion. And suspicion, once embedded, is incredibly difficult to reverse, because it doesn't require proof to persist. It only requires doubt. At the same time, international observers began paying attention, not because of the individuals involved, but because of what the situation represented. A potential crack in the credibility of American institutional integrity. And in geopolitics, perception of stability is as important as stability itself. If the system appears compromised, if justice appears selective, if power appears interconnected in ways that bypass accountability, then the implications extend far beyond domestic politics. They become global. This is why the stakes escalated so quickly. What began as a resurfaced controversy was now approaching something far more dangerous, a legitimacy crisis. Not fully realized, not fully defined, but undeniably forming. And within that formation, one question loomed larger than all others. How far would this spread? Because at this stage, the collapse wasn't about a single revelation anymore. It was about momentum. And momentum, once it reaches a critical threshold, cannot be easily stopped. It accelerates. It expands. And eventually, it forces a reckoning. The system had absorbed pressure before. It had survived scandals, controversies, and public outrage. But this was different. Because this time, the pressure wasn't coming from one direction. It was coming from everywhere. And when pressure becomes multidirectional, even the strongest structures begin to fail. The collapse had begun, but the real shockwave was still ahead. In the end, crises like this are never really about a single headline, a single document, or even a single individual. They are about exposure. Exposure of systems that were never meant to be fully seen. Exposure of relationships that operated quietly beneath public narratives. An exposure of a deeper truth that most institutions work tirelessly to avoid. That power, when left unchecked, does not disappear, it adapts. What we are witnessing is not just a controversy tied to names like Donald Trump or Pam Bondi. It is something far more consequential, a stress test of the very structures that govern accountability in modern democracies. Because when a system is forced into the light, two things can happen. It can correct itself, or it can reveal that correction was never truly built into its design. And right now, the signals are mixed. On one hand, there is scrutiny, more intense than ever before. Investigative pressure, public attention, and decentralized analysis are pushing boundaries that once seemed untouchable. Questions that were previously dismissed are now being taken seriously. But on the other hand, there is resistance, institutional hesitation, carefully managed narratives, strategic ambiguity. Because systems don't willingly expose their own weaknesses, they absorb pressure, they redirect it, and when necessary, they sacrifice parts of themselves to protect the whole. This is the phase we are entering now. Not the collapse, but the recalibration. Behind closed doors, decisions are being made, not about truth, but about stability. What can be acknowledged? What must remain unclear? Who becomes the focal point, and who fades into the background? These are not random outcomes. They are calculated. Because in a system built on interconnected influence, every action carries risk. Expose too much, and the structure destabilizes. Expose too little, and the pressure continues to build. And that pressure doesn't just disappear. It evolves. It shifts into public distrust. It manifests as political polarization. It spreads into institutions that were once considered untouchable. This is where the long-term consequences begin to take shape. Not in dramatic headlines, but in subtle erosion. Trust in legal systems begins to weaken. Confidence in political figures declines. The line between perception and reality becomes increasingly blurred. And once that line disappears, rebuilding it becomes exponentially harder. Because trust, once broken, does not return easily. Now zoom out. Beyond the individuals, beyond the immediate controversy, there is a larger geopolitical dimension unfolding. The United States has long positioned itself as a model of institutional strength, a system where checks and balances ensure accountability, where power is ultimately constrained by law. But when controversies like this emerge, when questions of selective justice and interconnected influence gain traction, it sends a signal beyond its borders. A signal that adversaries watch closely. A signal that allies quietly analyze. A signal that shapes global perception. Because in geopolitics, credibility is currency. And any indication that a system is compromised, even partially, affects how that system is viewed on the world stage. This is the hidden cost of scandals like this. Not just domestic instability, but international consequence. And yet, the most important question isn't what has already happened. It's what happens next. Because the future of this situation will not be determined by revelations alone. It will be determined by response. Will there be transparency or controlled disclosure? Will there be accountability or strategic deflection? Will the system demonstrate resilience or reveal its limitations? These are the decisions that define outcomes. And history has shown that moments like this, moments of pressure and exposure, are turning points. They either lead to reform, or they reinforce the very dynamics that created the crisis in the first place. But there is one final layer to this story, one that often goes unspoken. Because while systems operate at the highest levels of power, their consequences are felt at the lowest levels of society. When trust erodes, it doesn't just affect politicians. It affects citizens. It changes how people view justice. It changes how they engage with institutions. It changes how they interpret truth itself. And once that shift happens, it doesn't easily reverse. This is why the stakes are so high. Not because of the individuals involved, but because of what they represent. A test of whether power can truly be held accountable. A test of whether systems can function under pressure. A test of whether transparency is real or conditional. And as this story continues to unfold, one thing is certain. The final chapter has not been written. More information may surface. More connections may be examined. More decisions will be made, some visible, many not. But the direction this takes will define more than just a political moment. It will define the credibility of a system. And in a world where information moves faster than control, where narratives evolve beyond institutional boundaries, where public perception can shift in an instant, that credibility may be the most valuable and the most fragile asset of all. Because once people begin to question the system itself, they don't just look for answers. They start to question everything. And that is where real change begins.